Good afternoon to our webinar entitled Transparency Best Practices for Schools and Districts. My name is Baron Rodriguez, and I am the Director of the Privacy Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC. Joining me in this presentation is Michael Hawes, Statistical Privacy Advisor for the U.S. Department of Education, and Shane Morrissey, Student Privacy Analyst at the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar and hope that you find it useful. Let's begin covering the logistics for the day. Due to a large number of participants, we're in the phone lines. This allows attendees and presenters to have a more positive learning environment, hold music, coughs, and conversations that those on the webinar don't necessarily want to be part of. Kidding aside, we want this to be an interactive webinar. So we inserted polls throughout the webinar and strongly encourage you to enter questions in the Q&A box in the lower corner of your webinar screen. This webinar will be made available on the PTAC website within a few weeks at ptac.ed.gov, and all citations are available from within the new guidance document for your reference. As stated earlier, please put any questions in the box in the lower corner of the webinar, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. If we get to them, you can email us at our contact information, which will be listed at the end, but is privacyta@ed.gov. Now, to find out a little more about the audience on this webinar, so you'll be seeing a poll popping up here. Please indicate which sector you represent. K-12 administration, K-12 faculty, post-secondary administration or faculty, education technology industry, or other, such as a parent, student, or nonprofit organization. All right, looks like people are answering the poll. And go ahead and look at the results. All right, it's a chance to look at those poll results. We'll come back to those. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Michael Hawes. And while our primary audience for this guidance is schools and local institutions, much of this can apply to the state education agency or coordinating boards of higher education. With that, let me hand over to Michael Hawes, who will be going over what we'll be covering today and kicking off the best practices for transparency.
Thanks. In today's webinar, we're going to cover the basics about ensuring effective communication with the parents and students in your community. We'll start with a brief discussion about the changing role of data in our schools and how data practices are changing as we increasingly rely on contractors, vendors, and service providers to assist with the educational process. As many of you know, federal law requires that schools and districts provide certain information to parents and students. We'll briefly discuss those notification requirements. The bigger focus of this presentation will be on our recommendations for what additional information school districts should communicate to parents and students in order to promote transparency and openness about their data practices. As mentioned, I also want to note that although this presentation is primarily intended for schools and districts at the K-12 level, many of the recommendations and best practices we advocate in the guidance document and in this webinar are fully relevant for state education agencies and for post-secondary institutions. To that end, we'll discuss a recent case that we received relating to transparency at the state level and discuss these best practices in that context. Lastly, we'll open the floor to some of your questions. I'll provide some links to additional resources available on our website if you want additional information about this topic or other privacy or security issues. Slide, please. Student data. Data play an important role in our education system. Schools and districts across the country need to collect a variety of data as part of the educational process, including biographic and demographic information about the students, like name and address, performance information, like test scores and grades received, medical or health information, like allergies or disability status, disciplinary information, and much more. Next slide. These data play a critical role in our educational system. Enable teachers to identify students' strengths and weaknesses, to personalize the learning process to students' unique needs. They will enable school administrators to evaluate program effectiveness, allocate scarce resources to those programs with the highest impact, and predict and plan for future staffing and facilities requirements. Next slide. Administrators and faculty aren't the only ones who access student data, however. School districts often have legitimate educational reasons to authorize third parties to access these data. Sometimes they outsource school services like transportation and food service. Sometimes they rely on external experts to help improve the effectiveness of education programs. Often it is for reasons as simple and as necessary as outsourcing their IT services and data storage requirements to contractors who can provide a more secure and more cost-effective IT environment than the district could provide for themselves. Next slide. What are reasons for sharing data with third parties or for collecting it in the first place? Schools and districts have an obligation to be open and transparent about their data practices. Parents expect that schools will protect their children's privacy, and they expect schools to provide them with the information they need to evaluate if those expectations are being met. Many states have open records laws that compel districts to provide information about their data practices upon request. We recommend that schools and districts take a more proactive approach and be transparent about that information without waiting for a concerned parent to raise the issue first. Next slide. So what do we mean by transparency? Well, we believe that it is important that schools and districts inform parents and students about what types of student data they collect, why they're collecting that information, how data are being used, and whom those data are being shared. Next slide. Before we delve into explaining these recommendations in more detail, let's take a quick step back. This webinar and the guidance document we are discussing focus on our recommended best practices to promote transparency. There are, however, some requirements under federal law for information schools and districts must provide to parents and students on a regular basis. Take a quick look at those requirements before we move on to our recommendations. Can you walk us through the legal requirements?
Sure, thank you, Michael. Let's talk a little bit about how FERPA applies to this guidance. FERPA, or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, gives parents the right to access and ability to seek to amend children's education records. Further, it protects PII, or personally identifiable information, from unauthorized disclosure. Generally, there is a requirement for written consent for sharing of PII unless an exception applies. Let's talk about some of those exceptions. Directory information exception allows schools the ability to release certain information without consent. Examples include name, address, email address, date and place of birth, photographs, height and weight of athletes, and degrees and awards received. Even though consent isn't required, schools are required to notify parents of what information is going to be disclosed as directory information and provide parents the opportunity to opt out of the sharing of directory information. This is a limitation on a time period within which a parent or eligible student provides notification of their desire to opt out. The Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, or PRA, applies to elementary schools, generally applies to surveys of student behavioral activities. Use of personal information collected from students for marketing purposes and administration of certain surveys requires parental notice. The PPRA has the following general requirements. 1, a school or district to develop and adopt policies in consultation with parents, with limited exceptions. 2, provide parents with notice of these policies and rights under the PPRA annually. And finally, 3, notice has to be given within a reasonable time period after any substantive change is made to those policies. All right, so we're going to publish the previous poll and see what we have. Or we're going to do a new poll. So FERPA PPRA transparency. This one is really about how you feel your district communicates with parents about FERPA and PPRA. So do you feel like A, both myself and parents are FERPA and PPRA scholars, so they're very familiar? B, I think we do a decent job. C, we're pretty good in our communication with parents about these issues. Or D, what's a FERPA? We'll give it just a second and see if we can publish the results this time. All right. Well, we'll see the results of our poll with our webinar when we post it. They've changed webinar software, and so it appears we're having some technical difficulties with it. Look, it comes up. So it's like 68% of folks, they do a decent job, and the remainder are that they're pretty limited with that. So thank you for your results. We appreciate that. All right. Important to remember that meeting compliance is the minimum necessary under federal law, and the department strongly encourages the use of best practices regarding transparency around data systems. The guidance document covers 3 primary categories. 1, what information to communicate to parents, how to convey that information, and 3, how to respond to parent inquiries about student data policies and practices. Let's start with what information should be communicated and provided to parents around your district's data and privacy practices. First, you should be clear about what information you're collecting about your students. For instance, you should consider a self-assessment or inventory of what data you're collecting. You may be surprised at what data is being collected in your organization. It's a great starting place. Once you have this information, do the need for the collection of this information and publish the data inventory listing that information. It is noted that it is considered a best practice to provide this information at the data element level, such as birth or student last name. Next, you explain why you collect the information. For instance, is the data collected so that teachers can improve their classroom practices, or information required by state or federal collection requirements? Again, you may determine that there is some data that is collected that neither should be collected, that either shouldn't be collected, or is not needed. You should communicate with parents that you have security and data protection policies that will protect the sensitive information. This would include data retention policies that getting data when it is no longer required to be kept and/or is no longer needed. In addition, institutions should consider what privacy protections they have in place to protect against disclosure of small cells in public data releases. Ultimately, you should also train your staff on an annual basis and let parents know that this is part of your data privacy strategy. headlines have been around the concern of sharing of student data with third parties and or marketers. It is important that you share information, that if you do information with contractors or third parties, that you consider posting these contracts online. With each of those contracts, you may also want to explain why you share that data. For instance, if you're working with a vendor that provides student information services, you may articulate that. Also consider providing a list of online educational services, or apps, that's in the classroom. Remember that free apps may have a cost associated with them, and costs could be paid in the form of providing personally identifiable data to the company providing the free app. Cost to you may be your student's privacy. Research is a critical part of improving educational outcomes. That said, more often than not, results are rarely shared with parents. That if you are sharing data with researchers under an appropriate FERPA exception, to share those findings with parents and the public. In addition, it would be greatly useful for parents and the public to know of any changes to curriculum, policies, or programs as a result of the research findings. It may be appropriate to have an open forum or town hall meeting regarding risky online behavior to help secure student information in the classroom or at home. Be honest about the risks and suggest ways to mitigate potential risks, such as not sharing student logins and the use of free applications on school and home-owned equipment. Finally, do your parents know who to contact if they have questions about your data practices? Is information displayed promptly on your website? It's also important that you make parents and students part of the process. Consider asking for feedback and comments on your policies. And now I'm going to hand it over to Shane, who's going to discuss how to communicate data practices. Shane?
Thank you, Baron. When communicating with parents about data practices, how to communicate that information can be just as important as what information is actually conveyed. Next slide. Your website can be an incredibly helpful tool to present information. It's important to remember not just to post information, but to make certain parents know where to locate that information, what information is available. Electronic copies of your required FERPA and PPR notices should be posted. The detail that is given should vary according to the context. For example, when speaking with a parent in person, it shouldn't be necessary to recite a FERPA notice, but rather show the parent where it can be located. Next. Determining if your website is user-friendly, it can be a good idea to go to the site yourself and see how many clicks it takes to find all the relevant data practice and privacy information. The less clicks, the better. If you don't have one, it might be a good idea to speak to your IT professional or webmaster about adding a search tool to your website. Next. Some language related to data practices and privacy can be a little confusing, so it's important to be as clear as possible. It's a good idea to use plain language whenever possible, provide examples to illustrate complex ideas or concepts, include a glossary, make certain that your website's data practices section is accessible to persons with disabilities. Translate information on your website into other languages commonly spoken in your community, and maintain consistency across communication mediums. Slide. Information on your website may make sense to you. Not everyone will be as familiar with this information as you are. Reach out to members of the community and get their opinion. Do they think the site is easy to navigate? What improvements could be made to your website to make your website better? Next slide. And I think we're going to turn it over to Baron for a poll.
All right, we're going to try a poll again because we think this is a lot of fun. So let's do another poll on how familiar your parents are with your school district IT security and data practices. Remember, just because you are familiar with them doesn't mean that they are familiar with them or know how to find them. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to answer this, and then we'll back to this probably towards the end. We'll come back to that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Baron. So if done right, a good communication strategy about your data practices should, hopefully, reduce the number of parent inquiries you get. That said, no matter how well you've designed your website or tried to implement the recommendations we've discussed, you will probably still get some parents or students contacting you for additional information. To receive inquiries about data privacy, we recommend that you handle them in a respectful, responsive, and meaningful fashion. Next slide. First, be sure to keep the lines of communication open. Have contact information available on your website for the person or persons within your organization responsible for responding to parent inquiries about data. Also, say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and in this context, seeing data and how it's used, stored, and protected can go a long way towards answering parents' questions and responding to their concerns. When possible, have a mechanism in place for parents to see the systems that hold their child's data. Next slide. When questions do come in, be sure to review parents' questions or concerns in a thoughtful and careful manner. Even the most reserved parent can get, shall we say, passionate when dealing with issues relating to the well-being of their kids. When you get these concerned parents, don't dismiss their concerns or suggestions without sufficient consideration. Be sure to acknowledge their concerns and make every effort to ensure that you properly understand their particular question, suggestion, or situation. Above all, respond in a respectful and meaningful fashion. Next slide. And you may get questions that, for one reason or another, you cannot answer immediately. In these cases, be sure to keep the parent informed of your expected time frame for responding to their question. If you need more time to answer a question, be sure to keep the parent informed about any delays and when they can expect an answer. Next slide. Lastly, it's important to revisit your communication strategy from time to time to make sure that you're still providing the most useful information in the most usable manner. If you're getting a lot of questions about a particular topic or issue, consider adding information about that topic to your website. So we've talked about some best practices and recommendations for improving the transparency of your data practices, with particular focus on schools and districts at the kindergarten through 12th grade level. But as said before, many of these principles are relevant for state education agencies and post-secondary institutions as well. Can you walk us through that state-level case we got recently?
Recently, the Family Policy Compliance Office received a request involving a parent's request for student data from a state educational agency's longitudinal data system. This was complicated in that the state had no means at its disposal to provide individual student data, as it was primarily for the purposes of providing de-identified or aggregate data for improving educational outcomes at a statewide program level. So news would have had to have been developed at significant cost in order to provide the parent with individual access to the data. This answered back that way. However, the parent was not satisfied with the response and went to the media. FBO responded that the State Department of Education could fulfill FERPA-required parental access by allowing the parent to view the data included in the state system that included their children's info and providing the parent with a copy of their data dictionary, and if requested to do so, provide a reasonable explanation of the student's data included in the state longitudinal data system to the parent. In this case, the state would not be required to create new software, but would need to provide explanation and interpretation of the student record. So where did this fall apart? Well, simply communication. At the district level and at the state level, the parent was frustrated about who had what data on their child. When it didn't come easily or without significant cost or delay, the parent became upset. There are some great examples of transparency at the state level. Colorado has a site dedicated to data information and policies. It has a video about their data system and what it's used for. Several states, such as Georgia and Iowa, have created frequently asked questions about their data systems in an effort to improve transparency. So let's go back and look at our poll and see what you think about where you are with your communication with data systems. And it looks like the majority of you, 61%, think that you could do better. 33% do a good job, and then there are some outliers other than that. Well, thank you for returning that. This document is located on the PTAC website at ptac.ed.gov. All references and citations are there, and we are always looking for feedback and comments to our guidance. Please feel free to email us from the PTAC website with your comments.